So this lecture is on environmental law, something that's become more and more important. One of the things that is important, I think, is sustainability in terms of preservation of species, environment, preservation of air quality, water quality, and the ecosystems that animals use, and cleanup of toxic waste sites, which is very important. People get really upset if they find out they've been living on toxic waste and this has happened. So it's also about another goal is defending the right of all people to a healthy environment, something that we have sometimes fell down upon in terms of the poor oftentimes live in places where they are threatened by hazardous waste and other environmental problems. Anyway, so that's the goals, sort of sustainability, and also we want to keep the climate from changing too much, right? Okay, civil suits for toxic spills. Wrongdoers can be held civilly liable for harming the environment under any of the following common law causes of action. Trespass, so if you were to dump toxic waste on my property, that would be a trespass. Negligence, if you were careless and because of your carelessness some toxic waste came on my property, that would be negligence, and you'd be responsible for that. You have a duty not to be careless like that. So strict liability for ultra-hazardous activities. So oftentimes that would be a very good one for me to bring against a person. If he was engaged in some sort of ultra-hazardous activity like transporting oil and gasoline, transporting or using explosive, a construction company using blasting caps and other explosives, those are dangerous kinds of things, and if they cause harm, you can get sued for them. So if you come upon my property and do harm, and the harm arises because you're engaging in ultra-hazardous activity, I can sue you therefore. And finally, there's nuisance. Nuisance lawsuit. We'll talk about nuisance. There's public nuisance and there's private nuisance. Public nuisance basically has to be brought by the mayor or head of a county or state. Some state official will be bringing maybe a public nuisance action for the good of all the community. You yourself, if you have a personal interest, an individual interest, and want to protect your use of property and want to enjoy your use of property, and you're being interfered with unreasonably, you can bring a nuisance action. One of the problems is that these are very difficult to win, and they're also after the fact, right? You have to have, first you have to have the trespass, or you have to have the careless act resulting in harm, or you have to have some ultra-hazardous activity that's resulted in harm, and or you have some nuisance that has destroyed your peaceful, pleasant use of your property. And so you have to wait for that to happen. You can't sue because you think it's going to happen. So it's not proactive at all. As we'll see in terms of environmental law, the EPA should be a proactive force. Sometimes it's not as proactive as it should be, but it should be a proactive force because it has the power to be the proactive force. But some people don't want the government to do anything, so that we wind up with the Environmental Protection Agency having doubts whether they can do things. But they do have these powers and they should exercise them. They shouldn't worry about the Constitution in that regard. If they believe they have the power, they should go ahead and do it, and they should believe they have the power. Common law nuisances. Like I mentioned, public nuisance, if the harm arises in the general public out of the unreasonable use of property, then authorized public officials can seek abatement and damage. Or you can bring a private lawsuit. You can bring a private lawsuit if a person interferes with the property rights of you, and then that party may be stopped and is liable for any foreseeable harm that arise. You can also proceed in a private nuisance to try to enforce a public nuisance. But wouldn't it be nice if mayors in the county used government funds to do this obviously important governmental function of making sure that people are living in a clean, safe environment and not being unreasonably disturbed in their use of their property. Okay. Now I have to tell you that I have some pictures and I'll sort of talk about what goes on in the picture, and you'll see them on the PowerPoints. So this is a picture I'm looking at now, shows a river coming down and emptying into a bay. And you know, the bay has a lot of boats that are tied up at docks and out in the waters. And imagine people are going to use it to swim and to fish. Lots of nice use. And so this is what we're trying to preserve. The next picture shows, however, a factory. And it says smokestacks emitting black smoke into the air. Is it burning some oil in there? Something that maybe shouldn't be going into the environment nowadays. We maybe don't allow too much of that. For a while there, I think they had scrubbers to try to clean the stuff. I think now I don't see any smokestacks building smokes like I used to. Anyway, so not only that, but on the next slide, we see stuff coming out of pipes, water. Is it water? Some of the water seems to be brown or yellow, or who knows what color. What's in that water? Even if it's just hot water, it's going to kill maybe some of the environment, some of the ecosystem, or kill some of the fish or other living creatures or plants that are in the bay. So that will interfere with the peaceful use of it. Something that everybody can enjoy could be destroyed by a corporation which emits from its pipes things that ought not to be going into the water, and that includes hot water. Inadequacy of common law. So the problem with common law, so we saw the common law remedies: trespass, negligence, strict liability, and nuisance. Why do I say they're inadequate? Well, they often fail to prevent harms. So you can't do anything until you can prove that there's a harm occurring. So you have to have a harm first, and then you prove that this harm occurred. And then you get compensated for it. Probably not what you wanted was to be compensated for. You didn't want the harm in the first place. Abatement is only possible if the injuries are known ahead of time. I mean, if you've not been injured yet, and you can point to the fact that there is pollution going on, maybe, but that's about the extent of maybe preventing anything. And mostly it's going to be after the fact. So it's, like I say, it's not proactive. It's not preventing the harm. We like to prevent the harm nowadays. We're not living in the past. So, you know, this is, after all, the 21st century, not the 18th, right? So large incorporated businesses are difficult to sue. This is the second point. Large incorporated businesses are difficult to sue. They're difficult to collect remedies from, and to enforce significant punishment which can deter harmful behavior. So it's hard to enforce, you know, orders for them to cease and desist because, you know, they have a fleet of lawyers. Usually they have law firms that will actually defend them. And you can see this in, say, if you ever take a look at the movie Civil Action, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, where, you know, the lawyer working for the people who have been injured by the pollution is facing a team of lawyers, and it's a very pricey firm, one that those citizens that would not be interested in representing their citizens because they're interested in getting paid by the people who have money. And so it's difficult to sue these large incorporated businesses, who oftentimes even have influence with the judges, because these law firms that are the white shoe law firms, the expensive law firms, oftentimes are the ones who support judges in their elections, or support them in persuading maybe people to appoint them to the bench, depending upon your system of putting judges into benches. Okay, neither the monetary damages nor the punitive damages fines satisfy the victims oftentimes. And you'll see this again in the Civil Action movie. So I'll talk about that, like I said, later. I mean, basically, if your child dies or becomes very sick, or your grandfather dies, you're not going to be very happy. Well, if your wife gets cancer, you're not going to be very happy. If you get cancer, you're not going to be very happy. You know, and all these things are things that happen sometimes because of environmental pollutions that are preventable. Civil action. Now, here it is. I'm talking about it. I put it in the right place, right? A 1998 American legal film based on the book by Jonathan Harr. He was a lawyer, and this book was his memoir of his case Ann Anderson et al. Ann Anderson was one of the victims, and I think she lost her son, and others in the group lost children, or older parents. These people are just generally very vulnerable. Some of them maybe develop cancers, and so this is very typical of the kind of things that happen because of pollution. So, so he writes this memoir in case, in which the ruthless tactics of a white shoe law firm. To remind you, this is a very expensive law firm where the lawyers have gone to the top name law schools and have a reputation in the community for representing the people who have the money to pay them nicely, and they'll be assigning all kinds of people to a case with a corporation like this that's being sued. So they'll have a team of lawyers out there, whereas the victims may just have one, maybe two lawyers, and that's about it. Ruthless tactics, aided by a hostile judge. So sometimes the judge is I've actually had a judge call me a scallywag for no darn good reason, simply because I was representing somebody on a consumer complaint against a national gymnastic thing that had basically violated their contract with her, which they eventually realized they had to settle that case, and we settled it with him. But he actually was signaling, I think, to them that he didn't approve of these consumer complaints. He's very dumb. The ruthless tactics, because basically he's a consumer himself. He's not all that big. He's not all that rich. I don't know why he would be doing that, except he's got to be kind of dumb. Anyway, the judge defeats his efforts to win a fair compensation for the families whose children. So the judge is totally absurd, I think, in some of his rulings, requiring him to spend and spend and spend more money on experts and their studies to prove this and that and the next thing, and not willing to take just a little bit of proof, but wanting to have more proof. And so basically, they bled the law firm dry, and eventually the law firm had to settle for a pittance, and they didn't, in that sense, win some compensation for the family, but it was really nothing as to what they had thought they would be able to get for them, what would have been a fair compensation. The families didn't get that. The law firm went broke, and so he wrote this book. Had nothing else to do, I suppose. No, he went back into practicing law, but maybe he didn't do very good for his reputation. For the families whose children were harmed, he couldn't win his compensation for the family whose children were dead sometimes by a firm's illegal dumping of toxic chemicals. So he proved his case, and he had to pay experts to come and testify. He had to put them up into hotels because they had to have lodgings, and he had to put them up, and he had to provide transportation for them. He had to provide money so that they could do the studies they needed to prove what they needed to prove. So they had to make samples, take samples from the ground to show that it was polluted, and samples from the well in which the people were drinking from, which basically had the pollution in it. They had to do all this work, and it was like a major effort with equipment and people working for the experts. Basically, it was just too expensive for a small law firm, which had been a successful law firm representing people in claims that didn't involve that much expert testimony in it, perhaps with a judge who wasn't going to make them prove the ridiculous. So it's an interesting movie. If you ever see it, you should see it. You'll enjoy the movie, I think. I did anyway. Environmental Protection Agency coordinates standards. Okay, so its job is to coordinate standards. We have a lot of agencies. The two main ones, I think, are the water and the air, which are basically, they're looking at these as standards, but also the ecosystems, they look into those. And there are all these different, even for things like water and air, and for food, for these very essential kind of things, there might be 3 or 4 agencies that are involved in some aspect of regulating it. And so they have to coordinate all this. It's really rather ridiculous when you think of it, because it would be better just to put it underneath the EPA and let them organize it in a more systematic way. But that sounds more like planning. And of course, we're not going to plan anything because we're capitalists, right? And our government doesn't plan anything. We don't want a big government. We don't want a government that plans. We don't want to save the money that we can have by planning and getting better results. We don't want that. Okay, Environmental Protection Agency coordinates standards, pursues the enforcement of those standards, and establishes new improved standards. Monitors water and air environment regional standards, so it's keeping our air and our water clean. So our air and water is much cleaner than it was when they took over the task of cleaning it up and enforcing these standards. Reviews environmental impact statements. What are environmental impact statements? Whenever there's a major federal activity, they're building a dam or doing other major work, the Corps of Engineers, usually the Army Corps of Engineers does it, and it's going to significantly affect the environmental quality. So they're draining a swamp in Florida. They're going to have an environmental impact statement. The environmental impact statement will analyze its impact, adverse effects, and alternatives. Try to come up with alternatives to things that are being, hurt or damaged. And also it needs to note irreversible effects. Is there some endangered species that may disappear? And it has to kind of all report on that. If the agency decides an EIS, that's an environmental impact statement, is not necessary, it must file statements in support of that conclusion. So it has to give its reasons to think that. So they do the job. And they're very much restricted. Agencies are generally restricted. I mean, the ideal that they could exercise some sort of tyrannical power or torture or really become too much of a handicap for these large corporations is ridiculous. Air pollution. The EPA established standards and timetables. States formulate plans to achieve and to attain them. Civil penalties. Fines up to $25,000 a day. This is old. It's probably been raised. Should have been raised. Or an amount equal to the economic benefit. So, you got that or, so you could get maybe if you determine what the benefit that the company got out of it, so that they weren't getting a benefit by violating the law. Criminal penalties, fines up to $1 million and an imprisonment of up to a year for responsible officers and agents, And so, now the EPA is not going to bring a criminal suit. The EPA can only bring a civil suit. It can only collect compensatory damages and maybe in the proper case there might be some punitive damages that would go to the victims. The case the Jonathan Hare case that's involved in the civil action, actually after the case was closed, the EPA came in and corrected the pollution that was had been going on, and and so that shows you that there's some value to the EPA being there. And it would have been better if they'd been acting earlier, though. But see, they're not really going to be all that proactive as we would hope them to be. They could be, but I think they're largely handicapped by, Congress and by conservatives. Okay. Private suits. Citizens can file suits on their own. That's one good thing about our government. They do allow you to file a suit. All you have to do is go out and hire an attorney. They're cheap, aren't they? I don't think so. And you're going to have to produce your evidence. So are you keeping your good records? Are you keeping good records? Are you writing things down? You better be. Water pollution. Clean Waters Act, 1972. This amended a 1948 act. Safe Drinking Water Act in 1974, Marine Protection Research and Sanctuaries Act, 1972, Oil Pollution Act, 1990. Okay. Toxic agricultural chemicals. So we have the federal insecticide, fungicide, and rodenticide. What's a rodent? Well, it's a rat. A mouse. Rodenticide Act requires registration prior to sale. So we don't want these animals, some of them are endangered species, to die off completely. Registration prior to sale, certification of limits on approved uses, only limited quantities can be used on food crops. Reasonable certainty of no harm standard for allowing sale of chemicals. So that's the you know, making sure that there's no harm to human beings. Toxic Substances Control Act requires manufacturer, processors, and others to determine effect on health and environment. Includes special labeling. So if you are selling paints, you've got to put on there that they're highly flammable usually. Sometimes they could explode. If you're producing that could explode, you've got to put that on there. If something is toxic, it needs to have a label under the environmental laws. And it may need to have a label under other ones. Certainly if it's something that's going to be used in the home, sold in the grocery store, it'll probably be under the Food and Drug Administration required to do the same thing. So this is why I say there's some overlap that goes on in these agencies, which kind of is wasteful. And, you know, but that's just how it came about because of these acts being passed separately, looking into separate kind of things. Special labeling limits, you know, there will be limits to the use and production of certain things. So I used to have a very nice tree shoot spike that I would put in, but it would kill the insects, and they won't allow you to have that anymore. They don't sell it anymore because it was toxic in some ways. And it wasn't so much that they were worried about killing human beings as they were about maybe insects or other animals that were small and maybe endangered. Highly toxic substances ban. So there's a ban on highly toxic substances. Hazardous waste. This comes under two things. There's the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, we'll talk about that, and the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. The Resource Act, if a substance has a potential to pose an imminent threat to health or the environment, potentially poses an unreasonable risk of injury to the community, then the EPA, under either of these two prongs, may require special labeling and set production quotas or limit and even prohibit its use. CERCLA, the Superfund. The EPA was authorized under this act to create a hazardous waste site. So they can tell you right now how many hazardous waste sites they have and what they think the dangers of them are, how toxic they are, what kind of toxicity they have, what kind of things they have buried there in this dump. So they list and they rank these and clean them up. How do they rank them? Well, they rank them according to how dangerous they are and how close they are to a community. So if you have a waste site that's near, say, Chicago, and it's highly toxic, it's going to be high up on the list. On the other hand, if you had a waste site and it's got a little toxicity, but it's out in Omaha, maybe it won't be quite as high up because Omaha is so much smaller of a city. Not that we don't care about the people in Omaha, it's just that there's less likely to be problems out there because it's got less toxicity and there are fewer people to get harmed. And so we have listed these kinds of sites and then we set about trying to clean them up. However, it's very expensive, these cleanups, and so they had to come up with a scheme to clean them up. At first what they were using was the cost was to be recovered from potentially responsible parties, and this was the potentially responsible parties was. The top of the list was producers who generated the hazardous waste. Some of these producers are no longer around, so you couldn't just necessarily always get it from them, but those would be the first person to turn to if they were available. But some of them go out of business when they realize that they're toxic, they're sitting on a toxic waste. And the banks that have maybe mortgages on that land will not foreclose on the mortgage because they don't want to own the land because that would maybe make them responsible, as we'll see. Transporters who deposited the toxic substances on it. The party who owned and operated the site. So cities were oftentimes presented a bill by the EPA for a cleanup of a city dump because they owned and operated it. And largely they weren't monitoring who was putting what in there. They didn't know what was going in there. Certain factories maybe in the city were using it just the same as any other citizen. They are a citizen under the law, right? And so all kinds of things were in these city dumps, which is one reason why cities oftentimes had higher taxes than smaller towns because they didn't have big dump sites with lots of waste to clean up. That needed to be done something about soon. So we've been working on it. And you know, like I said, getting these potentially responsible parties to pay for all this is a task in itself. So the party who owns the site, you know, and it was for a while, and they've done away with this one. The current user, current owner, could be held a responsible party. So you have a farm, somebody illegal comes and dumps on your farm, you have to pay to clean it up. Generally, you could even apply in the original, under the original act for some sort of exemption. But now it's pretty well recognized that you are an innocent party, and therefore will be able to defend yourself on that basis. And nobody ever thought it was fair that way anyway. So that was potential parties. Okay. Other than that, then the cost of cleanup would fall upon the taxpayer. No politician wants to tax the taxpayers even for something as worthy as cleaning up a toxic waste site. So that's something that, you know, all politicians run on, the fact that they won't vote for taxes, right? And, you know, if they do vote for, if they say they're going to vote for taxes, sometimes they say, well, I'm going to tax people who make over $500,000. You know, and so that's what a lot of these people who are going to have a tax, all of them who are going to have a tax increase of any sort, is going to be usually on the witch. I haven't seen one, and I haven't seen a general increase in taxes. I've seen a cut in taxes across the board, benefiting largely the wealthy, because I didn't think they needed a tax cut, but they got one just like everybody else, but in their cases, they got lots more money because they were taking in much more money. And so you take in more money, you pay more in taxes. That is, of course, if everybody's paying the same rate, or the rich are paying something higher. Anyway, problems. One recognition of problems usually only arises after some horrific event has occurred. For example, the Love Canal, we'll talk about that in a minute, Exxon Valdez, or the notorious oil fires on the Cuyahoga River up in Cleveland. Coordination and research are difficulties of the patchwork quilt of agencies. So the agencies, because they have so many different agencies and they have varying jurisdictions, overlapping jurisdiction, it just increases the work. They oftentimes collect statistics and data, and so if you're going to do research, it becomes difficult to wade through all the research and data that these various agencies have produced. Oftentimes, you have to figure out how to get rid of the duplicity, where two agencies are counting the same things, and therefore the statistics would be exaggerated, right? Okay. The ability of corporations to overwhelm legal and research staff. So one tactic that has been used very successfully with, you know, a corporation maybe being investigated for violations of toxic waste, you know, violation of RCA, would be for them to collect and create all kinds of data and information and take down there maybe a half dozen trucks loaded with data. Okay, and now the agency is not going to be able to wade through all that data and get to the court within any time soon. And they're not required to actually do anything with the data as far as making it legible. And so this is a very successful tactic of overwhelming the agency with the amount of data that you give them. And, you know, rather than, you know, singling, as you would if you were going to use it yourself, you would maybe limit it to a certain extent and only collect as much data as you could process. But these corporations know what they're doing when they do this. Ability of a corporation to overwhelm the legal and research staff of the agency. The burden of proving difficult is difficult. It's difficult in science as to scientific fact. So it's difficult sometimes to prove a scientific fact. The standards are high. Love Canal, I told you we talked about that. 1946 to 1952, the Hooker Chemical Company, which I believe was part of Occidental Chemical Company, used the canal near Niagara Falls as a dumping site for toxic waste. So that was something, and they at some point decided that they were going to stop doing business there. So they covered over the canal with dirt, but they didn't remove any of the toxic waste that were down there. Didn't do anything about the toxic waste, it just remained there. And then the site was turned over to a developer who turned it into a nice little community. Nice name, right? Love Canal was the name of the community. And underneath it was this canal, which had originally been called Love. And it's a Love Canal region, which was near Niagara Falls. So they were using the canal as a dumping site for toxic waste. There were like 88 different chemicals that were dumped in there, and 11 of which were probably toxic, and some of them maybe highly toxic. Anyway, the chemicals were discovered oozing from the ground. In some cases, they were oozing into people's basements. And there was a lot of cancer being generated, and there were instances of both miscarriages and birth defects. And so this became a kind of national scandal, so much so that President Carter declared a state of emergency. And eventually the federal government would help pay money to evacuate them, some of the citizens. The state came in pretty quickly and bought the first 2 rows of homes along the canal, where the canal was located. So those people could immediately evacuate. The other people who were maybe not in those first 2 rows had to wait. They couldn't get anything, and eventually the federal government did find some funding for them, and were able to evacuate them also. But in the meantime, some of them, one lady, she's got cancer, and she's appearing on air talking about, nationally, she's talking about the fact that she's got cancer and she doesn't want to live there anymore, but she hasn't got anywhere to go. You just can't jump. I mean, they were not rich people, they were working people. They just cannot jump from this house to something else. You think about it, you generally need to sell your house to buy another house. And so they just were in sad shape with cancers and birth defects and miscarriages. I mean, it's terrible. The EPA estimated there were 32,000 chemicals dumped, 32,000 chemical dump sites. That's across the nation. So not all of them are going to be as bad as this, and not all of them are going to wind up oozing, and this is why we had to clean these up, why they were given a task of cleaning them up. So I think the Love Canal was a major factor in getting this law. The China, I'm going to talk about 3 Mile Island. The China Syndrome and the 3 Mile Island. The China Syndrome was a film which came out 12 days before the 3 Mile accident came out. So March 16, 1979, they released this film. It just happened to be about a nuclear accident like 3 Mile Island. It was very odd, wasn't it? Anyway, so that's just by the by. The 3 Mile Island accident was a partial meltdown of a nuclear reactor in Pennsylvania, which accident gelled, that is, brought people together on anti-nuclear safety concerns among activists and general public, and resulted in new regulations for the nuclear industry. So those industries had been, fighting regulations for years, but now they had to, accept new regulations because Congress and the people demanded it of Congress. Statistics showed an infant death rate within a 10-mile radius of 7.2 per thousand births in 1978, before the accident. But in 1979, after the accident, the number had risen to 15.7%. The accident was in March, so it was for about 9 months. That's really for a 9-month period that those increases showed up in. It's a more than doubling of the rate of infant deaths. And there were cancers and other problems from this Love Canal and from the 3 Mile Island accident. With the radioactive waste, you don't need to get a lot of it into it. Just one invisible isotope can cause you to get cancer. And so at 3 Mile Island, they were overwhelmed with being overwhelmed. Something went wrong with the pool that was meant to keep the reactor from getting too hot. And so there was a lot of water being generated. And one of the operators thought that there was too much water, and so he released it into the Susquehanna River. That water was radioactive, which may account for, and they only did that study for a 10-mile radius. That water went into the river, and I think the Susquehanna enters into the Ohio River, so potentially people downstream, maybe as far away as Indiana, might, because you don't need a lot of exposure to this kind of thing to have an effect. Of course, Indiana had its own problem down around the border with the American Lead Company, which was a toxic waste site because they were producing nuclear weapons there. Anyway, and that was right close to the northwestern corner of Indiana, close to Cincinnati. So I actually talked to people who had been injured in that. Exxon Valdez spill. Now this is another one of the famous cases involved. Litigation was filed on behalf of 38,000 litigants. These were people who were fishermen and other people who were dependent upon the resources there in Alaska where the spill occurred. And so the spill destroyed wildlife and fish and fishing areas for a long, long time. And so these people who were depending upon harvesting that were actually out of work. The people who worked in those towns, I don't know if they were included in this 38,000 litigants. They also would be damaged because the people who were fishing were going to go into town and eat, or buy stuff in the town. So it is just a disaster for that area. In 1984, a jury awarded plaintiffs a compensation of $287 million and also $5 billion in punitive damages. That's a lot. Exxon, on the other hand, was a company that made tremendous amounts of money. That may be not so much when you look at how much they made every year. Exxon appealed to the Ninth Circuit, and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal reduced the punitive damages to $2.5 billion. Exxon then further appealed it to the punitive damages to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they found a friendly court there, which in 2008 capped their damages. I imagine that means both the punitive and the compensatories to $507.5 million. A lot different than $5 billion punitives and $287 million compensatory, right? And so on August 20, and Exxon dragged its feet on top of that, so they wouldn't actually pay what they should, and so they negotiated it down to where they were only going to pay 75% of the $507.5 million damages, and agreed to settle in 1989 Exxon oil spill off Alaska, and so they only were going to pay 75%. In June 2009, a federal court ruled that Exxon had to pay an additional $480 million in interest on their delayed punitive damage award. Interesting, eh? Well, that had to be from when the court was a final judgment, because you wouldn't have to pay anything until you get a final judgment. We talked about final judgments before. Climate change. Climate change includes both the global warming driven by human emissions of greenhouse gases and the resulting large-scale shifts in weather patterns, both of which can then harm crops and also cause a lot of melting and runoffs, which will eventually cause problems for any coastal city and cause real problems for many island nations with the rising waters when they're eventually going to be swallowed up by the oceans, is the way it looks now. And I think that the fact that there's climate change, there are very few people who are willing to dispute that. What people do oftentimes dispute is more whether or not we are the cause of it or whether we can do anything about it. And I think we can do something about it, and I think we are a cause of it because of our use of petrochemicals and petroleum and gasoline. But there are other things that we're doing to cause this problem. And so the resulting large-scale shifts in weather patterns, though there have been previous periods of climatic change since the mid-20th century, the rate of human impact on Earth's climate system and the global scale of that impact have been unprecedented. We've never done this to the planet, and no other force has done anything like this to the planet. So we are just simply impacting our planet very tremendously. And the trouble is, it's the only planet we've got. Scientific consensus. That human activity has caused climate change is not disputed by any scientific body of national or international standing. The largest driver, the consensus also is that the largest driver has been the emission of greenhouse gases, of which more than 90% are carbon dioxide and methane. Fossil fuels burning for energy consumption is the main source of these emissions. with additional contributions from agriculture, deforestation, and industrial processes. We don't need to go into detail, but you see there's a lot of things going on there. So the solution is going to be difficult. Undermining public trust. There's a campaign. I think I said, okay. Organized denial propaganda. Basically, since 1970s, oil companies have published research broadly in line with their standard views on global warming. Despite this, oil companies organized a climate change denial campaign. So they knew the globe was warming, but they actually paid public relations people to spread this propaganda that there was no climate change. And even though they had studies saying it had been. So it's similar to really what we saw in tobacco, where the tobacco companies were denying that tobacco causes cancer when they had studies, their own studies showed that it did, and they did it anyway. So it's a public disinformation campaign. Oh, that's what you call propaganda, isn't it? Anyway, the campaign to basically deny the climate change was carried on by the same people who worked for the tobacco companies. So we come to the Paris Agreement, the Paris Accord. 2015, all UN countries negotiated. So the UN countries negotiated a Paris Agreement. So that's 187 of them now. Aims to keep global warming well below 2 degrees centigrade and contain an aspirational goal of keeping warming under 1.5 degrees centigrade. So, that's kind of maybe optimistic. The agreement replaced the Kyoto Protocol. There is no binding targets as there were under the Kyoto Agreement. Instead, the procedure of regularly setting ever more ambitious goals, reevaluating the goals every 5 years, has been made binding. So all these UN countries will come together to try to reach an agreement on how much they're going to reduce the things. The Paris Agreement reiterated that developing countries must be financially supported. So, if they're going to do the climate change, it might be difficult for countries that are developing, who will not have the advantage of burning coal like we did, perhaps. November 2019, 194 states and the European Union have signed the treaty, and 186 states and the EU have ratified or acceded to the agreement. However, of course, our own president back in November of 2019 said he was withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. Okay. Now at this point, normally I'd ask you if there's any questions, but you can't ask me any questions except if you send me an email. And if you send me an email, that's fine. Or you could come to one of the Zoom sessions that I have. And that's it. I didn't anticipate that I would be actually this short, but I am. Thank you very much for coming. So we're 40 minutes in.